Let's pivot to supplements for just a minute, talking about the muscle building side and the fat loss side. If we cut through all the noise out there of all kinds of like muscle building garbage supplements that are out there, like if people's focus from a longevity perspective, but also building muscle, losing fat, what are the best sort of like muscle building supplements they should focus on?
So I would say here are my top, I'm going to give you my top 4 supplements.
Okay.
Number 1, creatine, and not in no particular order. Creatine, omega-3 fatty acids, it's been shown to have impact on skeletal muscle, which even more so on females than males. I think there's some evidence to support that. Urolithin A, and I said vitamin D and creatine. That's it.
That's pretty simple. Now,
And by the way, if someone is eating a high red meat diet, they may or may not need more creatine.
Can you elaborate a little bit more maybe on mitophagy and like urolithin A?
Yeah, I would love to. When we think about how we examine our overall health and the things that we can do, that can be challenging, right? Because we want to know that what we are putting in our body is giving us a result, right?
Yes.
Some of us like to eat pomegranate or walnut, and we think that just because something has a phytonutrient or, again, something within a food matrix, that we are actually getting those things. But that doesn't always happen. And urolithin A is a postbiotic. It comes from an ellagitannin, this compound, these group of compounds called ellagitannins, which are found in pomegranate or walnut, typically these plant sources. And 30 to 40% of individuals do not have the gut microbiome to generate urolithin A. I don't know, have you ever taken a test?
No, I haven't taken a test, but I'm aware that, that's very small.
So there's a small population that can do it. I haven't taken the test either, but urolithin A is a compound that has a lot of good data, randomized controlled trials in older adults, and we're seeing it in athletes to improve this concept of mitophagy, which is the regeneration and cleaning out of these old mitochondrial cells, which you have to do. You have to rebuild and repair so that things, are much more effective and efficient. One of the things that happens with aging is our ability to turn over mitochondria declines. And so a way to support it is through urolithin A. And I am very hard pressed to be impressed with data. I am very impressed with the urolithin A data.
Yeah, the bit that I've seen as well, it's very impressive.
Yes.
And it's sort of this theory that floats around there that has a lot of logic and reasoning to it, that, okay, as you get older, and if let's pretend your mitochondria is becoming more dysfunctional, which more than likely it is as you get older, there's always a delicate balance of that mitochondria having, its daughter mitochondria and ultimately, basically the proliferation of mitochondria. But from a DNA standpoint, since mitochondria has its own DNA, if you have dysfunctional mitochondria, it's like a dysfunctional family having dysfunctional children, right? And like eventually you can end up down this rabbit hole. And there's literature to reinforce that, although it's, it's fairly mechanistic, but it makes a lot of sense. Then when you look at, okay, in an aging population, enhancing mitochondrial health so that those mitochondria can still, let's just call it procreate. That's a very simple way of putting it. That's not how it is. You're creating more mitochondria, right? Especially if you're putting the stops in place to create more mitochondria in the first place. Exercise, resistance training, yada, yada. I'll put a link down below for Timeline, which you and I both talk about this. Pretty much the only patented way to get urolithin A.
Well, and also the evidence is so good for it. There's years and years of data. It starts with mechanistic data, move to animal models and then to humans. And when we start to see randomized controlled trials in humans that hold up, especially when it improves endurance and strength, that is something I pay attention to as a practicing physician.
So after today's video, our sponsor is Seed. I put a link down below for 25% off their daily synbiotic. So it's a probiotic and a prebiotic in one. So it has a really unique delivery system. So I am a fan of probiotics when you're making a change to like your diet or a lifestyle, because it can kind of help remodel that gut microbiome to help you make that shift a little bit sooner. Now, full disclaimer, they're a sponsor on this channel. That's how this channel works. It's how we're able to create amazing content. But my promise is that I only recommend products that I personally have used or currently use. So Seed down below, that is a 25% off discount link, again, for their daily synbiotic. I would probably guess that you'd notice a difference within about a week of taking it. Start noticing it digestively, you might start noticing it in other ways, but for me, I got more energy, I started sleeping better, things just seemed more regulated. So anyhow, that link down below, 25% off.
I want to double click on fish oil, omega-3s for a second. So yeah, the literature is super fascinating. I'm quite aware of it, but I want you to kind of explain a little bit. Like I've seen cool evidence on protein synthesis, on insulin sensitivity, post-workout omega-3 utilization for increasing protein synthesis. Like,
yeah, and again, I'm not an expert on fish oil omega-3, but from the literature, there's a few things that I think are very interesting. I haven't seen it directly impact muscle protein synthesis, but there is some literature to suggest that it affects the ribosomal content and it impacts the ribosome of skeletal muscle, which I think could be very interesting. And there is some evidence that it lowers inflammation. And I would say that that lowers inflammation systemically. We see that in C-reactive protein. And we know that elevated levels of C-reactive protein it can be a risk factor for disease states, especially cardiovascular disease. So I think that there's a lot of evidence emerging really about the impact of omega-3 fatty acids on skeletal muscle.
Yeah.
And also even in the incorporation of it.
Yeah, totally. It's cool because that's going to be one that I would focus on the fat loss side as well, like especially from insulin sensitivity standpoint. Like if you are metabolically unhealthy, like these kinds of fats coming from EPA and DHA show really promising evidence with insulin sensitivity, which has a dual effect with potentially muscle protein synthesis. The more insulin sensitive you are, then maybe you can get that little impact with an insulin spike along with protein, possibly more insulin sensitive from a leucine spike with that. I digress, but from a fat loss perspective, just like I had mentioned before, like if your insulin levels are high and you're inhibiting lipolysis, but if you can start to increase that insulin sensitivity a little bit more, then perhaps you can bring those insulin levels down a little bit more. But I also just think just for general health, it's one of the most important supplements that you could take.
Yes, I would agree with you.
And so vitamin D is on your list for building muscle.
Well, I think it's really important for muscle health. And one of the things, again, as a geriatrician, is I am concerned about falls.
Yeah.
And there are vitamin D receptors on skeletal muscle. And we know that it is a risk factor for muscle health, low vitamin D levels, just because of that.
And then from a fat loss perspective, it makes perfect sense too. And there's I don't know if you've heard about how essentially vitamin D is sequestered in fat cells.
Yes.
So the more overweight someone is, the more their vitamin D gets soaked up into their fat. So it's like in the process of losing fat, you might need to be saying, hey, when I'm starting out, my dose needs to be higher. And then as you lose fat, you might be able to kind of titrate that dose and kind of bring it down and find your sweet spot.
Yeah. And you can see that in the blood work too.
Yeah.
That if you're dosing an individual who has more fat to lose, and let's say you're dosing them at 10,000 IUs of vitamin D and you're still not seeing an improvement, they sometimes have to be dosed higher.
Yeah. And I think just from a fat loss perspective, it's cool. There's so much like whey protein, like it's on the same list, muscle building and fat loss. Because this, obvious reasons for the muscle building. For the fat loss side, the satiety effect is a huge one. And just the kind of collaborative effect of saying like, hey, we're building muscle, then it's going to be a better
And
metabolic.
even there's also immunoglobulins. So there's alpha-lactalbumin and lactoferrin and these immunoglobulins that exist within whey protein that can help with inflammation.
Specifically concentrate in that case, right?
Yes. They can help with inflammation and have some immune modulating effects.
It's kind of funny because, one of the things that we learn in what we do with our line of work is that you have to be okay with changing your mind on things sometimes. And I have no problem with whey protein isolate. In fact, I still think as far as pure protein, it's clean, it's pure, it's simple. If I just want pure unadulterated protein, I'm going to go for isolate. I used to kind of bag on concentrate. And now, as I've taken a more holistic approach in terms of being I want as close to the whole food as possible, I've realized that lactoferrin and having those immunoglobulins from whey protein concentrate is super important for the gut, but also for the immune system. And and I actually, if I can get past the initial digestive issues that I kind of had with concentrate, which went away within a couple of weeks of just being consistent with it, I'm starting to think I might be more of a concentrate guy now.
Yeah, I love it.
So it's kind of wild.
Well, you're rethinking food in terms of a whole matrix.
Yeah. I still think isolate has a great place.
It does, especially for more mature adults that can't tolerate whey and really need to get their protein in.
So for fat loss supplements, for me, I'll add into the mix caffeine.
Oh yeah.
Caffeine is the most studied ergogenic aid that we know of. It's tied pretty close with creatine as far as like most heavily researched with the most evidence behind it as an ergogenic aid. When it comes down to fat loss, some of the clearest evidence that's there. I mean, whether it's because it's increasing your RMR because it's like getting you to move more, or there's actual, cyclic adenosine monophosphate kind of like activation that is literally helping you burn more fat. The mobilization of fat from caffeine is a very real thing. So like, I always tell people like make no mistake, like the best fat loss supplement that you could probably have is your cup of black coffee in the morning. And there's even some weird evidence suggesting that caffeine might help with muscle growth. But the only thing that might conflict in our two discussions here would be the co-ingestion of caffeine and creatine at the same time. Have you seen that?
I haven't.
Yeah, so when I had Dr. Darren Kandau on here, he was kind of speculating some of this based on some of the research, but then within the last couple of months, some literature has come out that is pretty compelling that, yeah, taking caffeine and creatine, they occupy similar receptors for transport. So if you take your creatine in the morning, you may want to separate it from your coffee by at least an hour. So it seems as though they don't mix.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
It doesn't negatively impact the caffeine, but the caffeine negatively impacts the creatine.
Interesting. Okay. So I have a question for you. Have you looked at green coffee extract, chlorogenic acid?
So chlorogenic acid is from a fat loss perspective, no. As an antioxidant, it has some pretty compelling research behind it. I am still inclined to go the theaflavin route. I think that I get more out of catechins from like the green tea and the EGCG than I do out of chlorogenic acid, but perhaps there's a co-administration that could be really interesting. What's your take on it?
I think green coffee has all of them.
Yeah.
Unroasted green coffee. I mean, it's very difficult to get, but.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's something that I'd like to explore a little bit more because there's, we talked about a little bit in one of our videos, but the relationship between coffee and frailty, coffee consumption and more mobility and less frailty as people get older. And there's one camp that suggests it's just because the caffeine is making them more mobile, because it's getting them more active and they're moving more. And that's a huge piece of it and probably is the main piece. And then there's another camp that thinks that it has to do with the chlorogenic acid.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they think that it has to do with more CGA, it has to do more with the antioxidant effect, and that's actually reducing inflammation enough that they're actually more mobile. And so I think it's probably a combination, but the chlorogenic acid, that there's been a huge resurgence of that as far as popularity is concerned.
I've been interested in it forever. There was this company that I used to use their green coffee. It was called Sun Up. It was amazing. Yeah. And they had high levels of chlorogenic acid.
Yeah, I think we need to start doing some more deep dives on this. And that's the cool thing about social media and where we're at now is like, as these discussions start to happen, it's going to spawn some more research out of it because people are like, hey, there's interest here, especially when there's something where there's potential money behind it too. Or like, oh, cool, like coffee industry can get behind this. There's a lot of, so we've got all of that.